Hello, I'm Michael Healy, and today, in this video, I would like to discuss something a little different. First, some background. Um, of course, I'm a Tolkien fan, as I've mentioned in several videos already, and Tolkien's had a very big influence on me. I mean, I've actually read the Silmarillion more than 10 times, and how many people do that, unless they're die-hard Tolkien fans? One thing I've always appreciated is Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, which I've also read multiple times. And I like his emphasis there on the idea that fantasy should be grounded in reality, and that this makes it more believable and increases the sense of immersion and increases one's enjoyment of the fantasy tale. And of course, that's exactly what he did with all of his stories of Middle-earth. He made it very believable. And in that light, a few weeks ago, I saw a video on YouTube by a man who calls himself Shad and who calls his channel Shadiversity. Maybe you've heard of him. He seems to be fairly popular. And he did a video on if merfolk were real, what medieval weapons would they actually use, given their characteristics and their watery environment. And he had some interesting points. He argued, first of all, that merfolk would not use slashing or bashing weapons, swords, maces, well, most swords, because water resistance would slow down your arm as you tried to swing those weapons. Both your arm and the weapon actually would face water resistance, and so it would take much more energy to use weapons of that sort. And this would also reduce their effectiveness. And of course, we all know from experience this is true. If you try to walk with your waist deep in water, it takes more energy than walking the same distance on land because you have to overcome the water resistance. And similarly, he argues that water resistance would make ranged weapons like bows less effective. And again, I think he's probably right about that. And so he then argues that probably for underwater combat, merfolk would use spears. Stabbing would be more effective than slashing or bashing, because with stabbing, there would be less water resistance. You're doing smaller motions, and your spearhead would be, I guess you could say, aquadynamic and move through the water smoothly. And then he also says scimitars would be useful underwater because those two can be used for stabbing. And finally, he thinks what about warfare on the surface? Because merfolk are traditionally depicted as being able to breathe air and not just water. So they presumably have lungs as well as gills, like some lungfish. And so if they could surface, and for fighting on the surface, he suggests they could use grappling hooks. Now, at first glance, this seems to make sense. Grappling hooks, for example, were originally invented by the Romans in the First Punic War for use in naval warfare. The Romans would use the grappling hooks to pull enemy ships close to their own so that they could send across boarding parties. And similarly, the use of spears and curved swords for stabbing makes sense in the aquatic environment. But I couldn't help but get the impression that Shad was overlooking something, and that is the question of whether the merfolk in their aquatic environment could actually make these weapons. And at least for scimitars and grappling hooks, I think the answer is no. And what it comes down to is whether merfolk could develop metalworking. And if they couldn't develop metalworking, they could not develop medieval or even Iron Age or even Bronze Age level technology. And here's why I don't think metalworking would be possible for merfolk. And there's several reasons. First is water resistance would also slow down the arm of someone who was trying to hammer something underwater, and would thus reduce the effectiveness of metalworking, because you have to hammer most metals in order to get them into this desired shape. To make a scimitar or a spearhead or something, that's part of the process, hammering the metal into the desired shape. But a more fundamental problem is metalworking requires you to create a furnace And that means you have to have a way to control fire. And that's much more possible in air. Fire usually will not burn underwater. Water usually extinguishes fire. We all know this. Now, of course, there are exceptions. You can use chemicals to create a fire that will continue burning underwater or even ignite underwater. Also, you've got volcanoes and heat vents underwater. But I don't think those would be a good solution, and here's why. First of all, many of the chemicals that will keep burning underwater have to be ignited above the water. And second of all, even the chemicals that might ignite underwater and the undersea volcanoes and undersea vents, I don't see how you could adequately control them to be able to create a furnace. Volcanoes, of course, are much too big to be controlled, and both volcanoes and undersea vents would heat a large area of water all around them, and I don't see how you could keep it limited to the size of a furnace. Furthermore, the volcanoes and vents aren't portable. You can't, and they can't just be created on demand. If Merfolk existed, they would need to be able to access metalworking technology wherever they were living, not just in certain places. Then there's the issue of the chemicals. Those two, I'm not sure you could keep their effects limited to just one small area of water. I think that would heat much too large an area of water unless the chemical fire you had was too small to be useful for metalworking. So I doubt that would work. But of course, again, merfolk in folklore and in fantasy generally seem to be able to breathe air. So could they have furnaces on land or on floating platforms? And here too, I doubt it. First of all, their fish tails would make it difficult for them to move on land. They'd be more vulnerable in that environment. I think they would mostly try to avoid going on land, even though they could breathe air. And then, because after all, water is still their primary environment. And I suppose, I suppose they would have difficulty surviving outside of the water. They'd probably be too slow to hunt for food or escape predators. It would be a very dangerous situation for them. And then as to floating platforms, I don't see how merfolk would ever invent floating platforms in the first place. If their primary environment is under the sea, they would have no reason to create ships or rafts or any other sort of floating platform at the surface. So I don't think merfolk would ever be able to develop metalworking skills. So they'd be stuck in the Stone Age, which means they would never be able to manufacture scimitars or grappling hooks. Those require metalworking skills. So then what sorts of weapons would merfolk use? Well, they would use Stone Age weapons, the sorts of weapons that our ancestors used thousands of years ago, before civilization, before metalworking. That would be the level of merfolk technology and merfolk weaponry. But not even all Stone Age weapons. I agree with Shad that slashing and bashing and ranged weapons would not be so effective underwater. Probably merfolk warriors would be limited to spears for stabbing and stone knives for stabbing. Would they develop ranged weapons? I doubt it, at least not for the underwater environment. Maybe they would have some specialists who would spend an excessive amount of time by merfolk standards at the surface learning to use ranged weapons, maybe using trees for target practice in the shallow waters. I don't know. But it could only be a small number of specialists who would learn to use bows or slings and such like things. Because most merfolk, spending most of the time in their primary environment under the sea, would never have a need for them. So that's the first thing. Probably the merfolk would be limited to knives for stabbing, spears for stabbing. But then there's another question that occurred to me. Would merfolk even be able to manufacture spear shafts? Is there anything available in an aquatic environment that could be used to make a spear shaft? And at first I thought the answer was no, and I thought they would be literally limited to just stone knives. But then I thought, wait a minute. For several years now, I've been living in South Florida, and there's mangroves not far from me. I mean, I could drive for an hour or two and see mangroves. And that's the obvious solution. They grow in shallow water. Merfolk could stay at least partly in their comfortable, familiar, watery environment and still harvest mangrove wood. And not only that, mangroves are highly resistant to rot, mold, and fungus. And there are people in our world today who do use mangrove wood to make poles and staffs, fishing poles, things like that. And so, yes, they could make, merfolk could access mangrove wood and make the mangrove wood into spear shafts and then attach a spearhead. And maybe they could attach the spearhead to the shaft with rope made from kelp fibers, perhaps. I think that's something else that Shadiversity suggested, that they could make things out of kelp fibers. So yes, I do think merfolk could manufacture spears, but they would be more like the spears our distant ancestors used in the Stone Age. They would not be like medieval spears. But these weapons would still be effective. I mean, with, for example, the volcanic rock obsidian, you can make a knife that's incredibly sharp, from what I've heard, as sharp as a modern surgeon's knife. And so in the hands of merfolk warriors, these stone spears and daggers would be highly effective, very deadly. So those are my thoughts on merfolk technology, what sorts of weapons merfolk would use. And I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. I know it's still small, but it's going to grow. Thank you.